Welcome to another episode of Politics in the Time of Corona.
This is a coup. Just so people know, this is a coup. Go ahead.
These are revolutionary times. I'm Noura Erakat with your favorite host, Bassam Haddad. We have a very special guest with us today who will be discussing the rise of anti-Asian racism in this particular moment.
And we are joined today by a wonderful guest who will be addressing a number of issues related to the pandemic. And before I start, or before Noura starts with the questions, I'm going to share with you who this awesome person is. We are joined by Connie Won. Dr. Connie Won. She is a co-founder and executive director of AAPI Women Lead. She is also the founder of Transformative Research, a community-driven research consultancy. Her work on ending racial and gender-based violence is rooted in her personal experiences and political commitments. She's been practicing yoga for 20 years and is a, I have no idea how to say this properly, Muay Thai. Is that correct? Enthusiast. The last word is enthusiast. So she's a Muay Thai enthusiast. I am very excited to be with you, and hopefully we will speak with you again. But for now, I'll give the stage over to my co-host, Noura Erakat.
Hi, Connie. Thank you for being with us.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for bringing me on.
So we're good. Obviously, we can't figure out how. We should have rehearsed how to say Mai Tai, right?
Mai Tai?
Muay Thai.
Muay Thai.
Muay Thai.
Muay Thai. I said it closer than you.
Well, I know you're good at it. How are you?
I'm okay. There's a lot going on. Lots of things happening at home, in the world, and in our organization. But otherwise, I think we're okay. I'm okay. Thanks for asking.
We're glad to hear that, and we know that's actually a big deal right now, especially as you've been on the front lines fighting against what has been a rise in anti-Asian racism in the course of the pandemic, which has, in many ways, not just by President Trump, but by many people, has been described as a China virus, or as somehow has to do with a particular geographic location. Can you give us a little bit more context for those who haven't been following it?
Sure. So there's been a couple of ways that the anti-Asian climate has kind of risen in our current period. We have the Trump administration and Fox News and a couple of other more reactionary communities who have called this the Chinese virus and or the Chinese coronavirus, right? When the right wing was called out on calling it the Chinese virus, they changed it and they decided to concede with Chinese coronavirus. Thank you so much.
Right.
So we have that. And then we also have folks who are kind of in the community trying, I think out in the world, trying to figure, they've been really reactionary and blaming Asian communities, Asian people for the virus. Some have said it's because this is where it started. And I think the reason why, people in the community are blaming Asians is because they literally, one, are racist, or two, just really need an outlet for all of their rage. And then it's being fueled by the U.S. administration, which I think in part, is to not clamp down, but to build upon their white nationalism. So I'll leave that there in case you want to follow up with questions about what I mean.
I would love to hear more, but I think that it's to clamp down on the white nationalism, but also to divert responsibility for this. I mean, the way that the administration has handled this has been such a blunder. So what an easy deflection, which is to fuel and foment white supremacy, which is to say this isn't our fault anyway, and it came from outside, and we should have sealed our borders, and especially to Asians, right?
Right. So I love that you said that. I think that's been kind of their history, right? Which is to clamp down on white nationalism. I mean, it's also voting season, right? And what better way to win your base and increase your base? What better way than to say we're here to protect you against a foreign invasion? And I don't think it's general that it's been called a war, right? Because what better way, again, to cultivate a base other than increasing patriotism. So there's that, right? And then there's also the deflection, which they knew that there was a potential for this virus since last fall, before it grew to this, right? And instead of questioning, the structure, the US structure and its inability to manage such a crisis, it's now being, blamed upon some foreign people. And then I think on the streets, what I'm noticing is people don't have the education around it and they're pissed. And so they want to find people to blame things on. They're enraged. And folks who typically, most of us when we're enraged, we need an outlet. And what better way or what better people than those you deem as vulnerable, right?
No, I
and you
think
don't face consequence.
That's absolutely right, especially when you think about that this isn't empirically based. We spoke to friends in British Columbia, we've spoken to friends in Europe. It has been confirmed that the first infections in those sites, even in Palestine, that the first infections were all transmitted through European tourists, right? And they know that and they've traced that, and yet none of those empirics have disrupted this narrative because they're not seen as outsiders in the same way that Asians would be seen.
Right. And I think that again is like a convenient scapegoat, but I also think it's a convenient, actually strategic, not convenient. I think it's a very strategic narrative to continue to perpetuate, right? And even later when the administration is going to like hunker down and say, actually, we're in this together, they're going to use that narrative again as US patriotism. So I think this is all very strategic and well done, to be honest.
So I've followed some of the worst attacks that have happened. Like, for example, there was an acid attack against an Asian woman in New York. I've seen, some really disturbing videos of young girls literally spitting on other school-aged Asian girls, blaming them for this. From what you've been following, what picture can you give us of what this landscape has looked like and the actual harm that's being done to communities?
So this is being the anti-Asian violence, that this climate is seen on multiple fronts. On the streets, we have a colleague who has created a hate violence database. And from that database, we know that about 100 forms of hate violence are taking place a day. So those are the empirical numbers. And then what it looks like on the day-to-day is there was a woman in New York getting acid thrown on her. There are people on the streets getting kind of jumped on the subway train, like at the station. There are, people who are being confronted at grocery stores, right? Being pushed and kicked. So there's physical forms. And then there's also, for instance, my family, my auntie has cancer, so she wears a mask. And just the other day, she was at the supermarket and somebody literally chased her out the supermarket. They were like, do you have coronavirus? And of course she's, small, and she's like, no. And they literally chased her out. So there are these physical forms, and then there's the terrorizing, right? My family is like, Connie, you should bring a weapon when you leave the house because they're going to attack you, right? So we're living under fear. And that doesn't, you can't necessarily collect data on that. Like, how many of you are scared, right? That'd be like a bazillion. So there's that aspect of it. And then we also want to expand, that this has been happening longer than before COVID took place. So there's been acts of violence against Asians for a long time. And I also want to think about, the institutional violence that's been happening to Asian immigrants and Asian communities in particular. I don't want us to just highlight like the physical forms of violence. I want us to think about, hey, Asians have this, especially Asian immigrants, undocumented immigrants don't have access to healthcare. That's anti-Asian violence too, right? Or we don't, we're more than 20% of the most poorest communities in New York City. That's also anti-Asian violence. So that's historic. A lot of our communities are too afraid to go to, the hospital because we also, we're worried about our documentation. We also don't get services. That's also anti-Asian violence. So there's a street that kind of on the grounds, there's the institutional stuff, and then there's definitely the lack of support that shapes our everyday existence as well. So I just want to kind of emphasize how scary it is to be alive in the US under COVID, on top of a pandemic.
And Connie, is this something that represent a spike, like a noticeable and evident spike? And if so, I mean, how much of a spike is it, considering that I am certain that this is not something that was absent before?
Well, there is a huge spike. I know, again, that Professor Russell Jiang at San Francisco State is collecting data. The Chinese for affirmative action are also collecting data. And as I was saying earlier, we're noticing 100 reports of violence a day. So that is exponential from what folks were experiencing, at least anecdotally on the grounds. In fact, in terms of anecdotes, people are like, they thought they were immune to violence this way. So now all these social media outlets are reporting, and they're these acts of violence where they hadn't before. So it's actually also, lifting people's eyes, like opening up their eyes. They're like, I didn't know that we were susceptible this way. So that's something for us to think about as well.
I'm going to say something that's totally problematic right now. Noura is bracing herself. Welcome to the club. No, I'm joking. We, as Arabs, we're like now more of a, we're more in the same circle. But I actually was asking because there is this perception that this sort of violence, this sort of discrimination, exclusion, doesn't touch on Asian Americans as much as it does on other groups. But I guess because of this connection, it actually shows that it's latent. It's always there.
I also want to remind folks that those forms of violence is what brought us to the United States in particular. And I've been emphasizing this, right? Most of us came here as a result of colonial or imperialist wars. Those are like the greatest forms of violence, right? You're talking about war. And then as war refugees were brought over here. So people tend to forget that history when they come here and are not confronted on the daily basis as, say, Black communities, Indigenous communities, maybe some Latinx communities, browner communities, right? But we forget that violence, again, is what brought us here. That was on the day-to-day. So that has to be remembered. And that also has to be taught in history.
And I think the other thing, that's definitely worth emphasizing, and back to your earlier point about a project of white supremacy, is one that tries to consolidate whiteness in ways that, makes it look like some communities are more eligible for it. And part of, for example, an Asian, success myth, or the Asian minority myth, that they're eligible for success, will, I think, touch on what Bassam is saying, which might have distinguished Asians as being less susceptible to the violences that you're reminding us of, the structural violence, the latent violence, and a historical violence. I mean, the fact that, people will see Asians as outsiders is the legacy of the exclusion of Asians from the United States through law, very explicitly through things like the Asian Exclusion Act, very explicitly in the demonization of Asian families, morality, women, in a U.S. context alone, you know, and in addition to, and ways that also, I guess more recently, have fomented and justified war on these communities in their homes.
Yeah, I really appreciate you historicizing the violence here in the United States, you know, naming the different exclusion acts, naming the different, you know, experiences with internment camps. And then even what I was reminding us earlier is like our access to healthcare, our access to services. I also want to make sure that we understand that when any of us subscribed to white nationalism or white supremacy, what we're seeing today is that that is not going to save us. Right? So I also want us to be critical of how it is that we inherited and subscribed to certain privileges, including white nationalism. And what we didn't appreciate was that that white nationalism is always contingent.
Absolutely.
And so a moment by which we get to question and be critical of how, yes, we were differently susceptible to racial violence. And now is a moment by which we say, my identity and my safety cannot hinge on white nationalism's acceptance of me.
Absolutely.
Right? And that's globally.
You know, amen and ashe, right? Because that's part of the lesson that Arab Americans have learned. They fought for eligibility and whiteness and were able to earn that legally in 1915 through the Supreme Court. But that dream has been shattered multiple times. Very obviously in the aftermath of the 1967 war, again, obviously in the first Iraq war, the second Iraq war, and then so blatantly since the U.S.'s global war on terror, which has made, you know, permanent that you are you are not part of a white project, and it will not save you. And this is something that the more that we remain invested in it, is actually working against our own interests, of the alliances that we can create, of creating alternatives for that future. So, I mean, and that's what, you know, will also inform strategies, because some people might see this moment and want to have a message of, but no, we're all the same and we're all American in this moment, right? This idea of let's all be inclusive, and that's how we're going to respond to this rise and acute anti-Asian violence, versus other approaches that I'm sure you're a part of and paving the way for. So can you tell us about that?
I really love how you're summarizing everything. I think that is what draws our connections together. And it makes me think two things. Historically, I've also mentioned this to people like Dr. Angela Davis. And there was a panel around, supporting Palestine. And it was a Palestinian Black solidarity panel that I witnessed once. And I remember saying to her that for me as a Vietnamese woman, it was so important to witness that panel because the traumas from imperialist wars are indefinite. And I know that as a survivor of intergenerational trauma from the Vietnam War. I think, these histories have to be reminded, and they have to be connected. So in this moment, I'm working with different organizations. I've called on communities, Latinx communities, Black immigrant communities, and asked them to issue letters of solidarity, to make statements, to show that they are in support of anti-Asian violence. That's some of the work that we're doing, a lot of coalition building. And in our coalition building, we're reminding each other of our histories and how they're connected, but also how we need to be more accountable to each other. That's one thing. In terms of AAPI Women Lead, we are hosting seminars online we are hosting workshops online around the histories of Asians and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And then on top of that, we bring in other non-Asian communities to show solidarity on these seminars or workshops. And then we bring in our healers, acupuncturists, yogis, or whomever, to help us process through the violence. So those are the different things that we're doing in coalition with other communities of color. The main thing around this moment is racial solidarity, if not international solidarity. It's super big. Otherwise, white nationalism will take it, will appropriate this moment and claim it as theirs. You know, it's we've seen it in history.
And I think that, you know, it's worth mentioning what this looks like on a global scale. So can we use white nationalism to also explain a kind of anti-Asian xenophobia that we might, for example, say does exist in other parts of the world, right? Even if through playful memes sometimes. What would you say helps to explain that?
I mean, one aspect that's related to this sort of maybe this commonality of being on the receiving end of racism is the fact that it's not just that people here are concerned about quote unquote the Chinese virus or the even government discourse at the highest level like would mention this, but there's this idea that the entire East Asian sort of hemisphere or territory is assumed to be monolithic, just like when after 9/11, the attacks of 9/11, so many people from South Asia were attacked, and they were not even Muslim or Arabs or anything of the sort. So there's this commonality that I think is not even a concern in the dominant discourse, because it's given that if you're from East Asia, it doesn't even matter too much. Same as if you're Arab or Iranian or Afghani, it's basically a monolithic whole that is not sufficiently important to be distinguished, whereby people are not distinguished from one another.
Yeah, I like that you guys are both saying those two things. One is that, in terms of otherizing, it's always convenient for the otherizing project to make the other monolithic, right? You homogenize everything. You erase the nuances and the complexities to make those that are being otherized a convenient placeholder for everything you hate. So we see that in what you're saying around the big convenient other. I think, and right now for Asians, whatever that means, we're the big other right now. And then I see that globally because we see it especially in Europe. We see it especially in white Australia, right? We see it also.
Well, as a settler sovereign, the commitment to whiteness is not contingent, but is actually the project.
And out of fairness and some form of objectivity, this sort of racism vis-a-vis quote-unquote Asians also exists in areas where people are themselves the recipients of racism, like in the Middle East, when people in the region, in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, and the rest of the Arab world, including the Gulf countries, people speak of Asians sometimes just as Chinese. They'll use the word Chinese to describe anybody who looks a certain way. So it's just to be clear, it's also global in that sense. So it goes even beyond, even if there is no power dynamic necessarily, it also all goes beyond the sort of Northern Europe and North America. This sort of like monolithicizing.
We interrupted you, however.
Yeah, we interrupted you.
I actually like that you said that because, again, it speaks to the convenience of otherizing across, I guess, what you're saying, across power. I think humans are unfortunately not willing to address the complexities of what it means to be human and in relation to each other. That's a more philosophical conversation, but I also think it's a political one, because I think that the charge is for those who are in power to create conditions by which people can be in relationship with each other without inflicting violence on the other, right? So if it's convenient for us to be other, I think that may or may not be the problem. It's that we are violent towards the other, right? Versus being able to relate to the other. And so going back to this nation state, to the US, there's the response to the other is to inflict violence on the other. That's how it relates. And then it coheres against the other. So white nationalism, multicultural white nationalism, coheres against the other and inflicts violence on the other. That's how it protects itself. That's its politics. So I hear both of your analyses about the world and about about the Asian right now being the quintessential other of the moment, And I kind of want to bring back this issue that, I think folks from the Middle East, I think our Black communities, African communities are still, and Latinx communities are still being, sites of violence, are still operating as sites of violence. Like Asian folks did not take the cake. There's still violence against our other communities. And I don't want to displace that either.
Well, white supremacist violence tends to be an equal opportunity distributor. So unfortunately, we're all going to bear the brunt. I think, the last thing I'll say on this is just, to highlight that there are certain bodies that could be read as being latent threats, of being embodiments of either physical violence or embodiment of disease or embodiment of, moral disruption, and certain bodies that are immune from that. And this is another episode that's demonstrated to us the kind of immunity, the impunity that, whiteness has of never, of not being, even though we had a guest yesterday who was sharing with us, you have to be of a particular socioeconomic status to have even been able to travel, to transport this particular virus, right? And that's not either as a structure or as a person who we're holding to account. And so again, just affirming and raising up what you're reminding us in this moment, and the imperative of racial solidarity and an analytic that reminds us of the structural violence and not just the spectacle of what we may witness.
And we would love to go on. I keep saying this during every interview. We would love to go on, but we would like to wrap up by giving you the stage to address anything you'd like to address that you think hasn't been brought up.
Oh, thank you. I just want to, I think these conversations are so freaking important right now, because I am weary of what's going to happen post, in scare quotes, post-COVID. I think it's going to be even worse than what we're experiencing right now. And so we have the opportunities to set the stage for what it can look like, because white nationalism, multicultural white nationalism across the board is going to try to take the stage. And so we have to form our alliances, knowing that it's going to be a struggle to defeat that. So I appreciate you guys having this conversation.
Thank you so much, Connie, for all of your comments and insights, and
for your leadership, in this moment. What you're also bringing us, you're creating the stage for us to actually come together and address to do that. So thank you.
And there's plenty to do, absolutely. And I just want to say that we're, again, very excited to have had Connie with us today. I just also want to point out, Noura is always looking at me, worried that I'm going to say something interesting. But Noura today actually put on her glasses. So this is also a new way of doing the show. So I just wanted to bring this up. Thank you all very much.
Connie's so confused.
Connie,
Thank you
it's okay.
so much.
Everything's going to be okay. And we're very happy to have talked to you. Yes, and please stay safe, and hopefully we'll be in touch and talk about any of this under better circumstances.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for having me. It's been great. I adore you both, so I'm full of gratitude.
Take care. Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.